that A, they take long periods of time, like decades, or if not half centuries or more, not the 2 years or 3 years that most of our project cycles are working on. And they don't simply get you from here to there in a nice straight line. They take you from here to there in long, unpredictable, sometimes very ugly routes that require much more serious attention to wrestling with the kinds of conflicts and disputes, even violence, that accompanies that kind of trajectory. You know? Now, let's have a look. Let's just move down through some of these things that I've already looked at. There's a particular class of problems that I want to try and communicate here that I think are especially germane to this particular issue. So how can we distinguish, for example, the roads and the irrigation, the standardized interventions, from these legal type interventions that I'm talking about? What analytically distinguishes these things? Are they a continuum? Are they different in some other kind of way? All right. I want to just, this comes from a paper I did a couple of years ago with Matt Pritchett, where we talked about two basic elements of decision making that are involved in development. The first of these is tasks that we'll just call discretionary tasks that require lots of frontline judgment calls by professional people. Right? Now, in the aggregate profession, in the professional world in which we all live, professors make those kinds of choices all the time. That's what it means to be a professional in some senses, that your expertise is being called upon to make judgment calls. In the world of macroeconomic policy, a bunch of smart macroeconomists meet several times a year and they all sift through the data and they emerge Delphic-like at the end of their meeting and say, interest rates shall fall by 1/4 of a point. Right? And we love policy problems like that. Right? Why? Because they can get incredibly powerful results or very powerful outcomes on the basis of a handful of really smart people that have studied for a long time, that are invested with all of this deep professional knowledge that the rest of us have no clue about. Okay? I sometimes say that those of us in the social spaces have sort of benighted envy. Right? We wish there was a tool at our disposal like interest rates that we could raise or lower by 1/4 of a point and watch the whole world turn. Right? But there aren't, and there shouldn't be. And if we think that if we only could try hard enough and get one, as we'll see shortly, I think we're part of the problem. Okay, next slide. But this, sorry, back up one. There we go. The second part of this is not just that we want various different forms of professional judgment being exercised. It doesn't have to be professional judgment. It could be any form of choice that has to be exerted to make decisions between options. And transaction intensiveness, which is to say the extent to which ongoing human interaction is required in order to produce the outcome. Okay? Education is the best example. Right? For you sitting in this audience tonight, you are probably already at your 14th or 15th or more years of education to get you to a point where you are right? And that means 200 days each year, 6 hours a day of painstaking interaction since the time you were 6 years old to teach you to read and to do all the other kinds of things that you went through. Right? Now, that's a transaction-intensive process. It doesn't matter whether you went to a private school, to a public school, to a charter school, or a home school. Pretty much you went through that same basic analytic process. Deep, face-to-face interaction over long, long periods of time. Now, education policy requires that you have, or in the capacity to enact in response to the educational imperative, requires that you have lots and lots of people who are willing and able to be able to engage in that kind of interaction over that extended period of time. Now, let's, when you think about an example of AIDS, for example, AIDS is acquired in the most intimate and transaction-intensive way, so to speak, but responding to it also requires even more forms of transaction-intensiveness in the sense that you're having to alter or you have to engage with people's very sensibility of how the world works in order to be able to change, potentially, what kinds of responses are being required. The imperatives of the system want the technology. They want the antiretroviral drug, right? Because the smart people can figure that out. And we can cost that out, and we can produce a strategy for responding to AIDS. If only we can get the smart people to come up with the drugs and the accountants to figure out how much it's going to cost, then we have our solution of sorts. Right? But AIDS isn't like that. It isn't just like malaria where you can cost out something like a bed net that will stop people from getting infected by a mosquito. Right? Malaria is a nice response, a nice problem in some sense for the international community, precisely because you can actually stop most of the bad stuff happening by the introduction of a very simple, straightforward, standardized, uniform technology called the bed net. Right? You can't get that same kind of response with AIDS because of this really human transaction-intensive process that's required to keep doing retroviral drugs for years at a time, right? And it requires, even for people to engage in the act of taking these drugs, a whole understanding, a whole cosmology of cause and effects built around science that for many people is just not how they think about the world. They think that having an injection is going to allow the spirits inside their body to escape, so they refuse to allow themselves to be injected. Right? That's not because they're silly or anything, it's just because their cosmology of the world and how it works, in that sort of way of thinking about cause and effects, that's the way in which they think about those particular responses. Alright, so when we go, let's get down to a couple of these things. You can put these together in a simple little 2x2 program, a little 2x2 table, and we can think about certain problems that are algorithms, if you will, where there's no discretion whatsoever and no human involvement. And banking has been wholesale transformed by the old days of having to do banking with people. And now pretty much 95% of our routine banking transactions don't involve any choice whatsoever. It's just all done by technology. Okay? So those are algorithms. But the way in which the policy space tends to operate is much more in these diagonals from the upper right to the lower left. Right? We start off trying to think of a technical answer to this. We want us to gather the smart people in the room. All right? We all love being invited to that meeting because it justifies our years of grad school and makes us feel very important. Right? And we crave being invited to that meeting where we are the expert that gets invited to it. And then we like emerging from that meeting with our solution, which we, the smart people, have figured out, which we can then Excel spreadsheet-ize and cost out and make very nice predictions that X amount of dollars spent in Y number of countries for Z amount of years will produce A amount of impact. Right? And if you can, and there are, as I've stressed, certain problems for which that's exactly the right way of thinking about it. There's these other class of problems, however, I suggest, these ones down this lower right category here of practices where we just have, where the whole system grinds to a halt, where we have very weak ways of responding precisely because there are these combinations of high amounts of choice by people and high numbers of human interaction. And problems that occur in that kind of space, which are the ones that I suggest are mainly to do with questions of institutional reform and legal reform. Right? These are questions that pertain to the rule systems that we've constructed to manage our lives. And any rule system is a social construction, and those rule systems are as different, usually, and varied as the contexts and the cultures and the political environments in which they are situated. Right? And because those have evolved over long periods of time, over long periods of contestation, and long periods of choice being made by people, right, it's very difficult to come up with standardized solutions to them. All right, now, so, for these kinds of problems, right, these problems that require large amounts of discretion and large amounts of transaction intensiveness, it's really important to understand context and process. Right? And you have to spend years, oftentimes, as external agents, even when you're a national of the country, to truly understand the way these things work. Right? So, from a practical example, from the work that we're doing in Indonesia, for example, at the moment on local justice reform, we're at the point now, 4 years into this whole cycle, after doing 4 years worth of research, now being able to finally articulate what we think is the right kind of response in that environment. Right? 4 years is an eternity in this business. Somehow we've been able to buy that space and the indulgence of our superiors to be able to get to that point, but we would have been much more successful if we'd been able to come with a land titling program, for example, right from the get-go, as some people in Cambodia have been. Right? And be able to solve it with a technology, solve it with a piece of paper that we can hand out. Right? If we give out 5,000 land titles, we'll produce Y amount of income gains for these people that now have property rights. Right? The system would fundamentally prefer that's how it would work. Right? A standardized, context-independent solution. But for these kinds of issues, deep understanding of context and process is fundamental. You cannot get at a solution unless you've gone through that process of doing that kind of work, and unless you've done it, you won't get the right kinds of outcomes. All right, so I think the next thing is a quote. 1 second, this next slide. This is from a wonderful book by Ron Heifetz and his colleagues of Leadership on the Line, which is that, and I think this is just a statement, but I believe it's very powerful and it's very true, is that the single most common source of leadership failure in pretty much all walks of life is that people, especially those in positions of authority, treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. We respond to the